The attorney slid a thick envelope across the polished oak table and looked directly at my older brother. "Before you sign," she said quietly, "there's one document you've never been told exists." My brother chuckled and leaned back in his chair like he already owned everything in the room. My stepmother smiled without even looking at the envelope. My father reached for his pen, impatient to get the meeting over with. Then the attorney opened the file, and every smile around that table began to disappear. My brother looked at me for the first time that morning, not with pity, not with arrogance, but with something I'd never seen in his eyes before. Fear. 6 months earlier, if someone had told me I'd be sitting in that office, watching my own family realize they'd spent 20 years lying to the wrong daughter, I would have laughed. Back then, I still believed blood meant loyalty. I still believed love was something you earned by sacrificing enough pieces of yourself. I was wrong. If you enjoy stories where patience defeats betrayal and justice always finds its way, subscribe and join us for more unforgettable stories. Now let me tell you how it all began. 6 months earlier, I was the kind of woman everyone called dependable, and somehow that word had become another way of saying disposable. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I was 37 years old, owned a small estate planning firm in Charleston, South Carolina, and lived in the same white clapboard house my late grandmother had left me 10 years earlier. The porch swing still creaked the same way it had when I was a little girl, and every Saturday morning I sat there with a cup of coffee before work, believing life, while imperfect, was still honest. It wasn't. I had one son, Oliver. He was 16, painfully polite, and possessed a talent that seemed almost unfair. He played the violin with the kind of emotion that made strangers stop walking just to listen. His grandfather, my mother's father, had spent 3 years handcrafting Oliver's violin from aged maple and spruce before arthritis stole the strength from his hands. It wasn't just an instrument. It was the last thing my grandfather ever created before he died. He had carved one sentence beneath the chin rest where only Oliver and I knew to look. "Protect what carries your heart." Oliver had read those words before every competition since he was 12. My older brother, Grant, thought sentiment was expensive nonsense. Grant was 42, charming when he wanted something, and impossible to refuse if you didn't know him well. Most people never saw the real Grant because they only met him in small doses. I had known him my entire life. I had watched him borrow money he never intended to repay, make promises that dissolved the moment they became inconvenient, and somehow convince everyone else that he was simply unlucky. Our father believed every word. "Diana always lands on her feet," Dad would say whenever I quietly solved another family emergency. "Grant just needs a little more help. A little more help." Those 4 words had cost me almost everything. When Grant's restaurant failed, I covered 6 months of payroll because I couldn't bear the thought of 12 employees losing their jobs. When his second business collapsed, I guaranteed the bank loan that kept collectors away. When his divorce became ugly, I paid his attorney's retainer because he claimed he couldn't see his daughter otherwise. Every time I helped, Dad thanked me. Every time Grant promised to pay me back. Neither of those things ever turned into repayment. I kept every canceled check in a gray filing cabinet inside my office because estate lawyers keep records of everything. I never imagined those records would one day become evidence against my own family. Looking back, I should have recognized the pattern years earlier. Instead, I kept believing the next emergency would be the last. Oliver never complained. That still breaks my heart. One afternoon, while I was balancing client files, I overheard him talking to his music instructor in the next room. "I'll wait another year," he said. The instructor sounded surprised. The Vienna program only accepts a handful of students every summer. I know, Oliver answered gently. Mom's helping Uncle Grant again. We'll go another time. I froze with my pen hovering over a signature line. I had never told Oliver I couldn't afford the International Music Academy that year. He had figured it out on his own. He had quietly sacrificed his dream before I ever asked him to. That night, I transferred another $12,000 to Grant because he insisted investors were finally coming aboard, and all he needed was one last bridge loan. One last. Those words should have come with a warning label. A month later, Grant called another family dinner. He announced he was opening a luxury waterfront restaurant overlooking the Charleston harbor. This one changes everything, he declared proudly. Dad nearly cried. My stepmother, Linda, squeezed Grant's arm, as if he'd already become the city's newest millionaire. Everyone applauded. No one mentioned who had guaranteed the commercial lease. No one mentioned whose credit had secured the construction financing. Mine. The contracts all carried my signature. Grant called it a family investment. The bank called it a personal guarantee. Only one of those descriptions was legally accurate. Construction began the following week. Meanwhile, Oliver received another invitation. This time it wasn't Vienna. It was New York. One of the country's most respected conservatories wanted him to audition using his grandfather's violin. He practiced every evening until the house echoed with music long after sunset. Sometimes I'd stand outside his bedroom door listening. Every note reminded me why sacrifices were supposed to matter, until they didn't. 3 weeks before his audition, Grant called, asking whether he could stop by. He claimed he needed to borrow a folding table for a promotional event at the unfinished restaurant. I wasn't home. Oliver was. Later he told me Grant had wandered through the house while looking for the table. I didn't think anything of it. Why would I? He was family. The following Saturday, Oliver came running downstairs. His face had lost every trace of color. Mom, I had never heard fear in my son's voice before. What is it? The violin. He couldn't finish. I followed him upstairs. The display case beside his desk stood open, empty. For a second, I genuinely believed he'd moved it. Children misplace things, even careful ones. Then I noticed the broken brass latch hanging crooked from the wooden case. Someone hadn't opened it. Someone had forced it. I searched every room, every closet, the attic, the garage, the trunk of my car. Nothing. Oliver sat silently on his bedroom floor, staring at the empty case, as though refusing to blink might somehow make the violin return. Then his phone buzzed. It was his cousin Emily, Grant's daughter. Oliver answered. He didn't say much, mostly listened. When he finally lowered the phone, he looked older somehow. Aunt Melissa said, Uncle Grant sold Grandpa's violin. The words didn't make sense. What? Emily was crying on the other end. She'd overheard Grant bragging that he'd found an old fiddle collecting dust and sold it to an antique dealer for enough money to buy imported marble for the restaurant bar. An old fiddle. 3 years of my grandfather's hands. The instrument my son had built his future around. I drove to Grant's house so fast I barely remembered the trip. He answered the door smiling. That smile vanished the moment he saw my face. Where is Oliver's violin? He sighed as though I were interrupting something important. Eleanor, calm down. No, it was sitting there doing nothing. My chest tightened. You sold it? He shrugged. It belonged to the family. No, it belonged to Oliver. You can buy another one, he replied. Honestly, what's the difference? Wood is wood. I wish I could tell you I screamed. I didn't. Sometimes betrayal is so complete that anger can't find a way through it. It becomes something colder, something much more dangerous. I looked straight into my brother's eyes. You sold the last thing Grandpa ever made. It paid for something useful. Useful. That word settled somewhere deep inside me. Then Linda stepped into the hallway behind him. "Oh, Eleanor," she sighed. "Don't make this into a family war over a violin." Family war over a violin. I nodded slowly. "You're right." Grant smiled, relieved. "I knew you'd understand." "I do." I turned around and walked back to my car. Neither of them noticed that I hadn't asked for the money. I hadn't threatened the police. I hadn't argued, because for the first time in 20 years, I had stopped trying to convince people to value what they had already chosen to destroy. Instead, I was finally beginning to remember every document that carried my signature. I drove home with both hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Charleston traffic crawled around me, horns blaring somewhere in the distance, but I barely heard any of it. My brother had just admitted he'd sold the one thing my son treasured most, and somehow I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I wasn't even angry anymore. I felt something far more unsettling. I felt awake. Oliver was sitting exactly where I'd left him, on the floor beside the empty violin case. He looked up when I walked into his room, searching my face for hope I didn't have. Did he still have it? I couldn't lie to my own child. No. He nodded once and looked back at the empty case. I figured. There was no yelling, no tears, just disappointment settling over the room like dust. "I ruined everything," he whispered. Those 4 words hit harder than anything Grant had said. I crossed the room, knelt beside him, and took his shoulders in both hands. "Listen to me very carefully." He finally looked at me. "You didn't lose anything. But the violin, you didn't lose it. It was stolen from you." He tried to argue. I didn't let him. And what someone steals says everything about them and absolutely nothing about you. For the first time that evening, his eyes filled with tears. "I was supposed to audition with Grandpa's violin. I know. I promised him. You also promised him something else." He frowned. I reached into the empty case and ran my fingers beneath the chin rest compartment where my grandfather had hidden those carved words. "Protect what carries your heart." The violin carried his craftsmanship, I said quietly. "You carry his heart." Oliver finally broke. He wrapped his arms around me and cried into my shoulder while I stared at the empty case over his shoulder. That was the exact moment something inside me shifted forever. Not because of the violin, because my son thought he had failed his grandfather, instead of realizing the adults around him had failed him. Someone had taught him that. Someone had taught him to carry guilt that belonged to someone else. I suddenly recognized the lesson. I'd been living it my entire life. After Oliver finally fell asleep, I walked downstairs, made myself a cup of coffee I had no intention of drinking, and unlocked the filing cabinet in my home office. It stood against the far wall, gray steel, 4 drawers, nothing remarkable, except it contained nearly 20 years of my family's history. Every loan, every guarantee, every contract, every promise. Estate lawyers don't throw paperwork away. We preserve everything. Until that night, I'd never understood why I'd kept copies of documents everyone else had forgotten. Now I did. I carried 3 banker boxes into the dining room and spread file after file across the table. Restaurant number 1, construction loan, personal guarantee. Restaurant number 2, equipment financing, bridge loan, commercial lease, emergency transfers, medical bills, attorney retainers. school tuition, insurance premiums. Each folder represented another crisis I'd solved, another sacrifice I'd quietly made, another promise Grant had sworn he'd repay. I opened a legal pad and began writing. Year, amount, purpose, repaid, outstanding. The outstanding column filled the page. The repaid column barely reached 6 lines. Around midnight, I stopped counting long enough to stretch my back. The total already exceeded $300,000. I checked the numbers twice, then a third time. They didn't change. $318,462. I whispered the number aloud, just to hear how impossible it sounded. $318,000. Enough to buy Oliver the finest violin in the country. Enough to send him anywhere in the world to study. Enough to change his future. Instead, it had financed my brother's past. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. How had I never seen it? The answer came almost immediately, because I'd never looked. Every transaction had been separated by months or years. A loan here, a guarantee there, a quick transfer, a favor. Each one looked small by itself. Together, they had become my life. I reached for another folder labeled Harbor House Hospitality, Grant's newest restaurant, the one everyone believed would finally make him successful. Inside sat the commercial lease, the construction financing, vendor agreements, insurance certificates, a stack of documents, nearly 2 inches thick. Every signature belonged to me. Not Grant, not Dad, mine. Grant had terrible credit after 2 bankruptcies. The bank refused to finance him. The landlord refused to lease the waterfront property. Suppliers refused 30-day terms. Until I stepped in. Just until the restaurant opened, Dad had said. You know your brother always pays his debts once he's back on his feet. I almost laughed remembering those words. Back on his feet? Grant had spent 20 years standing on my shoulders. Then I found the document I'd completely forgotten existed. The operating agreement. Near the bottom sat a clause highlighted by one of my assistants months earlier. Managing guarantor retains the right to withdraw financial backing prior to final operational certification should material risk substantially increase. Material risk. At the time, it had meant construction delays, fraud, financial instability. Now, I wondered whether selling collateral connected to a guarantor's immediate family counted as something else entirely. I wasn't sure, which meant I needed someone who was. The next morning, I called the only attorney I trusted enough to tell the truth, Margaret Ellis. We'd met 12 years earlier, arguing opposite sides of a probate dispute. By the end of the trial, we'd become unlikely friends. She answered on the second ring. You sound tired. I need an hour. You sound worse than tired. I need legal advice. Personal? Very. Come in. Margaret's office overlooked the marina. Normally, I loved the view. That morning, I barely noticed it. She listened without interrupting while I explained everything. The violin, Grant, the guarantees, the restaurant, the contracts. She asked only one question. Did he admit selling it? To my face. Witnesses? His wife. She nodded thoughtfully. Then she held out her hand. The agreements. I slid the stack across her desk. She spent almost 40 minutes reading in complete silence. Every now and then, she'd underline something with her pencil, make a note, turn another page. Finally, she removed her reading glasses. Eleanor. The way she said my name made me sit straighter. What? Has anyone ever actually explained these contracts to you? I drafted half of them. I know. Then what's wrong? She turned the operating agreement toward me. Nothing is wrong. She tapped my signature. Everything is in your favor. I frowned. What do you mean? You aren't simply guaranteeing this project. She flipped another page. Because Grant couldn't qualify. Every major financial obligation routes through your authorization. I know that. I don't think you do. She leaned back. The restaurant cannot legally open if the guarantor withdraws before final certification. I stared at her. It would shut the project down? It would stop it completely. My heartbeat quickened. What happens then? The bank reevaluates. The landlord can terminate. Suppliers demand immediate payment. She paused. And your brother would need another qualified guarantor, willing to assume every outstanding obligation. I already knew the answer before asking. There isn't one. Margaret gave a slow shake of her head. No. Silence settled between us. Finally, I asked the question I'd been avoiding. If I withdraw, you'll likely lose some money. I expected that, but you'll stop losing much more. She folded her hands. Eleanor, as your attorney, I can explain the law. Then her expression softened. As your friend, she waited until I looked directly at her. I'm going to ask you something no one in your family ever has. What? What does Oliver need? The question caught me completely off guard. Not what Grant needed, not what Dad expected, not what the restaurant required. Oliver, my son. I swallowed hard. He needs another violin. He needs to know his mother chooses him. Those words settled somewhere deep inside me. Margaret closed the folders. I don't think this case has ever been about a restaurant. Neither did I. Not anymore. When I walked back to my car, my phone buzzed. Grant. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. There you are, he said cheerfully, as though nothing had happened. Listen, I need you to sign one more financing amendment. Just routine paperwork. Routine. I looked out across the marina, where sailboats drifted quietly through the harbor. When do you need it? Today would be perfect. I'll read it first. He laughed. You always read everything. Not anymore. This time, I was going to understand exactly what every signature was worth. And before I signed another piece of paper, I intended to find the man who had bought my grandfather's violin. Finding the violin became an obsession I never admitted out loud. Every antique dealer within 100 miles heard from me that week. Most were kind. A few remembered seeing an older handcrafted instrument, but none could tell me where it had gone. Handmade violins, like my grandfather's, rarely stayed on the shelf for long. Collectors recognized quality when they saw it. By Friday afternoon, I accepted something I hadn't wanted to believe. It was gone, maybe forever. I drove home expecting to find Oliver practicing from memory, the way he'd forced himself to do all week. Instead, I found him sitting on the porch swing, with a notebook in his lap. He looked up as I walked toward him. I've been thinking, he said. I sat beside him. So have I. He smiled faintly. I don't think Grandpa would have wanted me to stop playing, just because someone stole one violin. A lump formed in my throat. He definitely wouldn't. Oliver opened the notebook. Inside were pages of handwritten music. I've started composing my own piece. You wrote this? He nodded. I couldn't play his music this week, so I thought maybe I'd write something he'd be proud of instead. I looked at the notes covering those pages and realized something my brother never would. Grant had stolen an instrument. He hadn't stolen the gift. That evening, I returned to my office one last time. Margaret's words echoed in my mind. What does Oliver need? Not what Grant wanted. Not what my father expected. What did my son need? He needed a mother who stopped financing everyone else's mistakes. He needed security. He needed someone willing to disappoint adults, in order to protect a child. I opened the Harbor House file one final time. There was no anger left, only clarity. I drafted a formal notice withdrawing my financial guarantee from every agreement connected to the restaurant project, effective immediately under the material risk provisions of the operating contract. Then I called the bank. The loan officer already knew my voice. Mrs. Brooks, he greeted warmly. I need to withdraw my guarantee. Silence. Then I'll prepare the paperwork. No arguments, no lectures, no guilt, just procedure. Afterward, I called the landlord, then the construction insurer, then the primary supplier. Each conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Each one closed another door my brother had assumed would always remain open. I never raised my voice. I never mentioned the violin. I simply exercised rights that had belonged to me from the very beginning. 3 days later, my father called, not to ask how Oliver was, not to apologize, to demand answers. What have you done? I've protected my family. You've destroyed your brother's future. No, I answered quietly. He did that the moment he decided my son's future was worth less than imported marble. He tried to interrupt. I continued. For 20 years, every emergency in this family somehow became my responsibility. That ends today. Eleanor, I love you, Dad. I always will. But love doesn't require unlimited access to my life, my savings, or my son's dreams. When the call ended, I cried. Not because I regretted my decision, because I finally understood how heavy a burden I'd been carrying. Sometimes freedom doesn't feel like celebration. Sometimes it feels like grief. A month later, Harbor House never opened. Without my guarantee, the financing collapsed. Investors walked away. Contractors stopped work. The waterfront building sat empty behind locked gates. Grant told everyone I had ruined him. I let him. People who wanted the truth eventually came to ask for it. People who preferred his version never would. My stepmother stopped calling. The silence was strangely peaceful. Dad sent 2 birthday cards that year. Neither mentioned the restaurant. Neither mentioned the violin. Both simply ended with the words, I hope you're well. It wasn't everything, but it was more honesty than we'd shared in years. 6 weeks after everything fell apart, my office receptionist walked into my room carrying a long rectangular case. There was no return address, she said. My heart stopped. Inside lay a violin, not my grandfather's, a different one. Beautiful, restored, professional quality. A small envelope rested beneath it. Inside was a handwritten note. A collector recognized your grandfather's signature after hearing your story from one of the dealers. He had already sold the original overseas months earlier and couldn't recover it. He asked me to tell you he hopes another musician gives it the same love your son clearly gave the first one. He asked me to remain anonymous. I read the note twice before calling Oliver. He arrived breathless from school. When he opened the case, he didn't speak. He simply lifted the violin into his hands and closed his eyes. That evening, music filled our house again. Different instrument, same heart. Months later, I found myself sitting in the same attorney's office where this story began. Grant sat across the conference table, surrounded by paperwork he barely understood. Dad looked exhausted. Linda wouldn't meet my eyes. The attorney slid one final envelope toward Grant. Before you sign, she said quietly, there's one document you've never been told exists. Inside was my formal release from every financial obligation connected to his businesses, effective immediately, permanent. Grant looked at me in disbelief. You really mean it? I met his eyes calmly. I should have meant it years ago. For the first time in my life, I walked out of that room without wondering whether everyone else approved of my decision. The approval that mattered most was waiting for me at home. That evening, Oliver played the piece he'd been composing since the day his grandfather's violin disappeared. When he finished, he looked at me and smiled. I think Grandpa would have liked that one. I smiled back. I think so too. I never recovered the violin my grandfather built with his own hands. Some losses stay lost. But I recovered something far more valuable: the courage to stop confusing sacrifice with love. The moment I stopped paying for everyone else's choices, my own life finally began to grow again. Some betrayals don't end in shouting. Some end with a signature. Some debts aren't collected in court. They're collected the moment you stop carrying them for someone else. If this story reminded you that protecting the people who truly love you is never selfish, let me know in the comments. What would you have done in my place? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next unforgettable story. There's always another family secret, another quiet betrayal, and another debt waiting to be collected. Until next time, thank you for watching,